The book that I have coming out next year is largely about why this giant rift has opened up in America in a time when we are historically wealthy, when we really don't have any major foreign crises on our hands. We don't have a lot in common anymore, is the sad truth. I mean, a nation is defined by a common history, a common culture, a common set of goals, common institutions. All of those things are being torn asunder by serious divides that we have about how we view our own central principles. And we used to be unified by a belief in God-given rights and limited government. Obviously, that doesn't unify us. We used to be unified by belief in Judeo-Christian virtue. That no longer unifies us. We used to be unified by a belief that America was essentially a good place, even though we'd never lived up to our full promise. Even that, I think, is no longer a unifying principle, which is why we now have people who see American history as in Howard Zinn fashion. It's just a long history of suffering and pain and patriarchal institutional discrimination. If those gaps don't get bridged, I think that we're headed toward a schism that is going to grow larger and larger over time.
Comes the most powerful and most strategically oriented bureaucracy in our government, the one I spent 31 years in, the military. Here is what it has decided for Afghanistan. And I bet you don't know this either. We're in Afghanistan as we were in Germany post-World War II. That is, for at least a half a century. It has nothing to do with Kabul and state building, nothing to do with fighting the Taliban or proving that we can reconcile with the Taliban, and nothing to do with fighting any terrorist group. It has everything to do with three primary strategic objectives. And I really, as a military officer, as a professional, I don't necessarily object to these objectives, but I believe the American people probably ought to be told about them, and there ought to be a debate as to whether or not they want to spend their money on these objectives. First objective is to be in the place that Donald Rumsfeld discovered was the most difficult country in the world to get military power into in 2001, and take my word for it, it is. Look at it on a map and leave it there, because it is the only hard power the United States has that sits proximate to the Central Base Road Initiative of China that runs across Central Asia. If we had to impact that with military power, we are in position to do so in Afghanistan. Second reason we're there is because we're cheek and jowl with the potentially most unstable nuclear stockpile on the face of the earth in Pakistan. We want to be able to leap on that stockpile and stabilize it if necessary. And the third reason we're there is because there are 20 million Uyghurs, and they don't like Han Chinese in Xinjiang province in western China. And if the CIA has to mount an operation using those Uyghurs, as Erdogan has done in Turkey against Assad, there are 20,000 of them in Idlib in Syria right now, for example. That's why the Chinese might be deploying military forces to Syria in the very near future to take care of those Uyghurs that Erdogan invited in. Well, the CIA would want to destabilize China, and that would be the best way to do it, to foment unrest and to join with those Uyghurs in pushing the Han Chinese and Beijing from internal places rather than external. Not saying it's going on right now, you didn't hear that, but it is a possibility. So that's why we're there, and I'll wager there are not a handful of Americans who realize that we, our military, has decided that for these strategic reasons, which are well thought out, we're going to be in Afghanistan for the next half century.
Let's talk a little bit about the United States. The United States is the only regional hegemon in modern history. Most Americans don't think about this, but the Founding Fathers and their successors went to enormous lengths to ensure that we would dominate the Western Hemisphere. That involved conquering huge swaths of territory and making sure that the power gap between us and Mexico and us and Canada, us and Brazil, us and Guatemala was enormous so that they could not cause us any trouble. Second thing we did was we instituted the Monroe Doctrine. We basically threw the European great powers out of the Western Hemisphere and told them they were not welcome back in here because we did not want any distant great powers coming into the Western Hemisphere. That was all about establishing hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. Second goal, which is reflected in U.S. foreign policy in the 20th century, is to make sure we do not have a peer competitor. There were 4 potential peer competitors in the 20th century: Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union. The United States played a key role not only in making sure each one of those countries did not dominate either Europe or Asia, but also played a key role in putting all four of those countries on the scrap heap of history. The United States does not tolerate peer competitors. And the United States, to go back to my first point, is deeply committed to dominating the Western Hemisphere. Now let's talk about China. As China gets more and more powerful, and that's going to happen, the question you have to ask yourself is, what will China do with all that military power? My argument is that China will imitate the United States. They'd be crazy not to. They're going to try to dominate Asia the way we dominate the Western Hemisphere. If you're in Beijing and you're a national security advisor, don't you want a China that is much more powerful than all its neighbors? The Chinese understand full well what happened the last time they were weak. They call it the century of national humiliation. They know what the Japanese, the Americans, and the European great powers did to them. So they want to be very, very powerful, and for good reason. And they're going to want to push the United States out of the East Asia. They'd be crazy not to. As my mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If we can have a Monroe Doctrine, why do you think they're not going to have a Monroe Doctrine? So China's going to try to dominate Asia. Then the question becomes, what do you think the United States is going to do? The historical record is very clear here. We don't tolerate peer competitors. We're not going to let them dominate Asia if we can prevent it. And in fact, this is what the pivot to Asia is all about. We see them rising, and we want to maintain our dominant position in Asia. The end result of this is the Chinese are going to push in one direction, and we're going to push in the other direction. And it is going to be an intense security competition. Again, this is not to say we're going to have a war. But the Chinese are going to do this not because they have a voracious appetite for tromping on people or they have a particular aggressive gene. It's because the best way to survive in the international system is to be a regional hegemon. They understand that, and at the same time, we're not going to let it happen.
Thank you, John Mearsheimer. There's a lot of human nature in how states act because they're run by people. States, just like people, care about their social status. People care about their social status. They care where they are in the social structure. And for states, that's the international system. And there's also a belief by states that the higher you are on that, in that international system, the more the benefits will come to you.
The United States must make sure that we do not have a peer competitor for our security. Think about what this means. This is a brutalist philosophy. The proposition is that even if China were to change in some of the ways that proponents of engagement have been said that we hope it changes, even if they just, as a thought experiment, adapted our Constitution and our laws wholesale, we should still try to limit their growth merely because we shouldn't have a peer competitor. That is the proposition, regardless of beliefs, regardless of people striving for human flourishing along the lines that we have been prescribing to the world for decades. If they actually appear to be succeeding, regardless of their beliefs, we must stop them, even if it means pushing them back toward poverty.
Robert,
Have I misunderstood?